was interested in learning about different aspects of human behavior. And that was like including the way we interact with each other, how we learn, and how our past experiences influence our daily life. So that's what led me to psychology. And then last year I was looking for a research assistant position, and I came across the Sustainability, Identity, and Social Change Lab. I joined the lab because I wanted to increase my understanding of the factors that lead to social change and what direction this change takes. So specifically, I could say, like, how do we relate and interact with nature as well as with each other? And what's the influence of our collective power on social change?
Last semester of my undergrad degree, I took Michael's, it was a grad level course, but they let a few undergrads in, which was awesome. And, you know, the benefit of taking a course like that as an undergrad is such a small class. I think so it really gave me the opportunity to really get to know Michael better, you know. Yeah, and so from taking that course, I learned about the research that Michael's doing now and was super excited about it and really fired up about it. So just from talking, you know, in that small setting with Michael about that research, I was like, okay, this is awesome. This is what I'm going to do now. So in taking that course, it really kind of made up my mind of exactly what I wanted to do in grad school. And it just, you know, obviously I'm super grateful that I was excited.
Since my undergrad, when I mean, I always was originally interested in doing clinical psychology, as maybe many you know, young psychology students are, but really just through taking intro to social and then intergroup relations with the specific professor that I had at McGill University, where I did my undergrad, that's what really just made me so interested in the questions and the theories and the ideas that were coming up for me as I learned more about social psychology. And ultimately, I ended up doing 2 honors projects, research projects as an undergrad in that professor's lab at McGill. And that really just, awoke this love of research and just the ability to ask interesting questions and test them out in the real world. And, you know, things I care about deeply on a level beyond just my academic interest, but in terms of, you know, my political interest and just, you know, what I hope for the world in terms of justice and equality and health and well-being. And specifically around Michael's lab, I was really just, you know, excited to meet Michael as a potential supervisor. And I think he really sold me when he told me that he was interested, as I was, in qualitative research methods and in exploring. He recognized he didn't have a ton of experience in this area either, but that we both had this shared interest in a kind of social psychology that was moving outside of the typical lab context into community-based, participatory, action-oriented research. I was really interested in that, and I was really grateful to find a supervisor who was interested in learning and exploring that kind of new, different approach to methods within social psych with me.
I had done quite volunteering in the downtown east side of Vancouver before I even came to SFU. So social justice and things like that have been a passion for me for, you know, my adult life, basically, which is longer than I care to admit. And so, you know, when I came to SFU, I decided I wanted to finish my undergraduate degree. So I came to SFU and was really impressed with the research being done there by Dr. Wright, by Steve, who was my undergraduate supervisor, and by Michael as well, and the rest of the social faculty as well. And so from doing my, you know, my honors degree at SFU, I got to know the faculty really well. And, you know, was really, like I said, really impressed with what they were doing. And yeah, so it's kind of a no-brainer for me to apply, you know, to SFU for my graduate studies. Focus of the lab is environmental sustainability, and looking at that through a social psychological lens. And so, you know, we believe that these broad systemic changes need to take place for us to really mitigate climate change. And to bring about these changes, people need to obviously, take the appropriate action, which is for the most part, it's necessary that it's going to be collective action and, through environmental activism that. And so the research is looking at the antecedents of people identifying as activists and being willing to take the appropriate action, the necessary action. So that would be like voting for policies, protesting, things like that. And so what we're doing now, which I think is really cool, is we're looking at whether people's ability to imagine an alternative world, so it's called a cognitive alternative. So you've got like the status quo right now, so the way things are. And if you're able to imagine something different, to that, for example, living in a society where we're living sustainably, we're using clean energy, things like that. If you can imagine that, well, then you'll be more likely to take the necessary steps to bring about alternative future, right? So it comes down to whether you can even imagine something as being possible. And then if you can, that will kind of set you down the path to make these changes. And so what we're doing is we're asking people, can you imagine this alternative future? So the study I'm working on right now is a qualitative study. So we're just asking people to, through an interview format, just to describe what this world would look like. And we're getting some super interesting responses ranging from, differences to, obviously technology would be different, intergroup relations. So how would we be interacting with each other differently? And so that's what I'm working on right now. And my honors research, my master's research will be something similar, but I'm not exactly sure what that's going to be yet.
So my dissertation research that I've been doing in the lab with Michael is a little bit of a standalone project. It's not as connected to other things going on in the lab as some of the other folks, but really grateful that Michael's open to working with me and being a really great collaborator on the different projects that I get up to. And in this particular case, my dissertation is focused on what I think is a really interesting example of a kind of meta approach to looking at prejudice and discrimination and the way that different forms of oppression intersect. And the context is actually in anti-stigma campaigns. So these are specifically in the area of substance use stigma. Over the course of the last 5 or so years, with the opioid overdose crisis really skyrocketing and just thousands and thousands of people dying of overdoses every year, there's been an increase in governments and health authorities recognizing that stigma or discrimination, prejudice towards people who use drugs is a major problem, and it's a major barrier increasing overdose risk and ultimately leading to some of these numbers of people's deaths. Increasingly, what organizations have started doing is developing, massive, large-scale interventions to attempt to reduce stigma towards people who use drugs, which is great. But what's interesting and maybe a bit troubling is how they tend to do that. And so that's actually been the focus of my project, is looking critically at the ways that governments and health authorities, especially, and other types of groups, are approaching this problem of stigma through anti-stigma campaigns.
A cliched answer maybe, but like climate change is, I think, the defining issue of our time, right? Like there's a threshold that we need to, stay below in terms of carbon, and in our atmosphere. And, we have a responsibility to take action now. So that's why I think the research is important. And again, the steps that we need to take to mitigate climate change are going to require collective action and activism and things like that. So getting a better understanding of why people, identify as activists and take certain actions, I think that's really important, especially when you're creating like an intervention, for example. So if you know what encourages people to identify as activists and so on and so forth, well, then you can design interventions perhaps for the general public to try and, get people to sort of get on board with that sort of thing. A lot of my undergraduate research focused on economic inequality. So different obviously from environmental sustainability, but so many of these social justice issues are intertwined. And so, we believe that addressing climate change is going to require us to make these systemic changes, which will also address things like economic inequality and systemic racism and stuff like that, right? So, in that sense, they're all intertwined. And so, my passion for addressing economic inequality, that's not completely in the research that we're doing now.
Looking at the more systemic level and thinking, well, how is stigma produced? Who does it benefit? And maybe does that explain in part why we see this kind of pretty limited focus of many anti-stigma campaigns? And then when we're thinking about interventions of how do we really truly address stigma in all of its intersectional forms when it comes to substance use, how can we actually try and change that at a more systemic structural level? For example, by changing drug policy, by decriminalizing substances, by just normalizing use and changing the treatment system, the healthcare system, et cetera, rather than just maybe trying to focus exclusively on the individual heads of people who maybe have stigma towards people who use drugs.
From my experience in the intergroup relations lab with Dr. Wright, it's very collaborative, which is awesome. I mean, you're not only learning from Steve, but you're learning from graduate students and other undergraduates. So it's a very, very positive atmosphere. And, just from being involved kind of on the periphery of Michael's lab in my undergraduate degree, I get the impression it's very similar, very, very positive and very collaborative. So, yeah. I mean, my advice would be to, get involved as like a research assistant, for example. And I understand that not everyone has those opportunities. If you're working full time and you're taking a full course load, it's not always the easiest thing to do. But I know the department has introduced a new course that you can take, which is the research engagement course, in which you work as a research assistant and you get course credit for that. So, if you're finding you don't have the time to work as a research assistant, I strongly recommend that people take that course because, the relationships that you form as a research assistant and the connections and that kind of stuff are so important for getting into the honors program and, of course, the master's program. So I would do that soon. I wouldn't wait until your third or fourth year of your undergrad to do that. And then, of course, that opens the door to other opportunities. Like I said, like you can do a directed study or an undergraduate student research award. So there's all kinds of opportunities that come from volunteering as a research assistant. So I think it's super important. And I think as a lab, we've talked about this recently, and we're trying to really make things as inclusive as possible for research assistants and to really accentuate the benefits to research assistants because they're so crucial to the research that we're doing. So we want to make sure that these other opportunities and things like that are available to the research assistants and practical skills as well, like using software like, SPSS and things like that. So, that's my advice, to get involved and that kind of will set you on the path to doing these other really cool opportunities that are available.
I would just say approach the lab you're interested in and let them know about your interest and how you can be an addition to the lab.
If you're interested in pursuing graduate studies in psychology, my big recommendation would be to definitely think long and hard about the pros and cons of that specific path and make sure that you're really, really interested in what you want to research, what you want to study, and that you have a lot of, maybe even different interests. The other thing I would encourage you to do is to really think broadly about your interests. I think sometimes, especially I know for myself at an early stage in grad school, you kind of think you get this one random idea that comes to you and you think, what, I'm going to do a whole project about that. And you might not maybe consider the value of doing something, especially to start out, that's more collaborative, that just is building on someone else's work, that is maybe even and analysis of existing data, and how valuable that can be for not only learning, important research skills in a maybe more productive and quicker way, but also in getting publications at an earlier stage in your graduate career. So those would be some of the two things that I would say for advice.